Good morning, everyone. Let's see who's in the room. Can you say good morning?
Good morning.
Yes. I'm sure the coffee helps. A few little woos too. I like that energy. Welcome to Climate at Crossroads, tackling disinformation in economic and environmental policy. Come on in for those of you who are just arriving. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I am the Executive Director of the Walrus. We are thrilled to be here in person in Ottawa at 50 Sussex, home of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. It's a beautiful location, and for those who are tuning in online, Ottawa is changing color right now. It's a great day. We are streaming live across the country and beyond on the Walrus's YouTube channel, so appreciate everyone who is logging in right now. I want to start by saying thank you to the McGill School of Public Policy and the Center for Media, Technology and Democracy for bringing us together today, and to the Canadian Geographic Society for welcoming us into their space. Now we're here to talk about climate, specifically climate at a crossroads, and it's really important that we come back to the land that we are on. So I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory in Canada's capital city. Ottawa is home today to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We encourage you to reflect on the land that you're on, and especially how it informs our conversation today, and for those who are joining us online, wherever you may be. A little bit about the Walrus. The Walrus is Canada's conversation. We cover stories across Canada to offer a deeper understanding of who we are for those inside and outside the country. This year, from tariffs to taunts of becoming the 51st state, Canada is the conversation. And the country is standing strong. We're responding to this moment with facts, analysis, even a little humor, as is the Canadian way. At the Walrus, you can find us online at thewalrus.ca. In print, on newsstands, or by subscribing to The Walrus. You'll also see our latest issue here for those of you who are in person. You can also listen to our podcasts, and our stories are also available online in audio. And you can join us in person or online at events like this one that take place across the country. If you'd like to learn more about our work, if you were here today at the event, just swing by the registration table. You can chat with our team, sign up for our newsletters, and as well subscribe to the print edition. And for those of you who are online, just click around our website at thewalrus.ca. We're really excited to be here today, teaming up with the McGill University McGill School of Public Policy for a second year in a row. Now I am excited to introduce our partner in today's endeavor, a fellow Jennifer. Jennifer Welsh is the Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security at McGill University and the Director of the McGill School of Public Policy. She was previously Professor and Chair in International Relations at the European University Institute and Professor in International Relations at the University of Oxford. From 2013 to 2016, she served as Assistant Secretary General and Special Advisor to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the responsibility to protect. Jennifer is the author, co-author, and editor of several books and articles on international security, the UN Security Council, civilian protection, humanitarian action, as well as Canadian foreign policy. She is an international fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Please join me with a warm round of applause in welcoming Jennifer to the stage.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's such a pleasure to be here with a fellow Jennifer. Yes. From the Walrus, and welcome to everyone online and in the room with us today. As you will see if you saw the initial video, our school, the McGill School, has a mission to be a national and a global hub for public policy education, for world-class policy research, and for dynamic conversations about pressing public policy issues globally, nationally and locally. We attract talented students, some of whom are here at the conference today, but who you will meet this evening at our reception as well. Those students take a one-year MPP degree that marries top policy thinking and research with real-world practice. We also sponsor cutting-edge research that touches directly public policy challenges, and we regularly convene policy stakeholders in a way that we're doing today across sectors to co-develop solutions to challenges facing our local societies, our national society, and globally. Now, this conference today is funded by the donors of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission, which was co-founded and chaired by my predecessor and inaugural director of the Max Bell School, Chris Reagan, who's here. He'll be on one of the panels today. It was launched in 2014, and those of you who know about the Eco-Fiscal Commission will know that its role was to identify and promote practical, cost-effective fiscal solutions for both economic and environmental prosperity. And the Eco-Fiscal Commission, we all believe, improved public policy dialogue in Canada and made a real impact on public policy. When its work officially ended, we at the school, in cooperation now with the Walrus, have continued convening these annual conferences and public forums on economic and environmental issues. So I want to thank the Chisholm Thomas Foundation, the Ivy Foundation, the Metcalf Foundation. I know I'm short. I have to get closer to the microphone. Always happens. At least you can see me, right? That's the main thing. The Peter Gilgan Foundation, the Trache Foundation, the McConnell Foundation, and of course the Max Bell Foundation for the steadfast support of the Eco-Fiscal Commission, but also continuing support of the Max Bell School. Now, we're all here today because while we've had no shortage of innovative economic tools and policy ideas, the integrity of our information environment, the very foundation of sound climate governance, is under growing strain. Climate disinformation is no longer loud or obvious. It's becoming more sophisticated, more subtle, and increasingly difficult to detect. With the rise of generative AI, it's also becoming faster, cheaper, and more scalable, allowing false or manipulative narratives to spread across borders, whether they're provincial borders or global borders, in seconds. And these campaigns are not simply a byproduct of our online ecosystem. They represent deliberate efforts to shape public opinion, distort markets, and delay the policies we know we all need to address the climate crisis. So today's theme of our conference, in collaboration with the Walrus, is climate disinformation. And it asks us to see this issue for what it truly is, not just an environmental challenge, although it is that, but also a structural threat to democratic governance itself. So over the course of the day, we're going to hear from researchers, policymakers, journalists, and advocates who are mapping this new landscape and working to ensure that our democratic institutions can withstand this challenge. It's an urgent and deeply interdisciplinary conversation that we all need to have. We're thrilled to be launching it, having it today with all of you, and I'm very glad that we've been able to partner with the Walrus, who shares our values and our objectives, and working together. So I'm really excited to get started. I want to welcome to the stage our first panel, who will be discussing the theme of mapping the climate disinformation space, and particularly the moderator, Sonia Solomon, my colleague at the Max Bell School. She's an assistant professor of research who's been working deeply on these issues, has been our ideas partner in convening this entire day. I'm very thankful to Sonia, and she's also with the Max Bell School's Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy. So Sonia and panelists, please come up to the stage to get us started. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much, Jennifer. As Jennifer mentioned, climate disinformation has evolved dramatically. So what began as very deliberate efforts to deny science have now evolved into far more subtle efforts to delay solutions and actions. And as we've heard, it is no longer a fringe problem. It's now baked in to our information ecosystem as a structural barrier, and one that has certainly distorted the debate in Canada and abroad, and that undermines the trust that's needed to govern effectively. So as we've already heard from the framing of today's event, this really raises critical questions about the concept of information integrity. And it's a lens that information integrity is a lens that a new global architecture is coalescing around, from the UN's Global Initiative for Information Integrity on climate change to other national initiatives, as well as policy interventions from the European Union, France, Sweden, the UK, Australia. Democracies around the world are beginning to grapple with this concept. So I think this raises really critical questions for us in our panel, in our first panel here today, around how do we ensure that information integrity is shaped by democratic institutions, democratic voices, and it's not shaped by platform companies or industry actors with vested interest. So how does the political economy of disinformation undermine that integrity? So I think this next panel will help us understand some of these dynamics and the landscape. So to unpack all of this, I will go to Amy Janzwood from McGill, Chris Russell from Re.Climate at Carleton, and Michael Khoo from the Climate Action Against Disinformation. So Chris, maybe we'll start with you. You've worked on how climate narratives circulate and surface in the Canadian public discourse. So we'll start with opening remarks from everyone and turn to our audience very shortly for questions. So start noodling on those as you listen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to everyone for showing up and platforming this important discussion. Let me start with something that's really fun to think about first thing in the morning. I'm sure some of you took notice last month when pollster Bruce Anderson reported that 34% of Canadians agreed with the statement that climate change is a hoax. Big number, one that's pulled up from where you might expect to see it by conservatives coming in at 45% agreement, and young Canadians, 18 to 29, 46% of them agreeing with that statement. So I figured this might be a good group to puzzle out what that's telling us. I spend my days looking at how people engage with climate content, and I can say for certain that more adversarial, manipulative, and conspiratorial worldviews are shaping the ways in which climate content circulates and people make sense of it. And that drift, if we want to call it a drift, is unmistakable across the whole range of issues: climate science, climate policies, climate impacts, climate solutions, climate advocacy. There's a lot of discussion around the kind of people that concern themselves with this. They're called the climate people, and you would be in that group if you show up to events of this sort. Climate denial is quite old. Sonia's work's been really important to me for reminding me that there's a historical context to this. And you really do see it in this content. If you look at it, you'll see content from the 1990s. You'll see content from the Harper years. There's a very popular trope that circulates around CO2 is life and that the earth is greening. That goes back to the 1980s, and it kind of resurrects itself anytime there's a discussion about regulating CO2 as a pollutant or trying to reduce emissions. But I do think it would be a big mistake to undersell the degree to which the digital systems that now organize our information environment, the incentives and the affordances of those systems, the ways they're being leveraged by some of the political actors we've been pointing to. Something is different in this moment. It's not completely new, but it is intensifying, and it is urgent and alarming in my view. So maybe one way to try to make this point is to take us back briefly to 2021, not the pandemic part of it. Take those bad feelings, push those down, save them for your therapist. I'm talking about the climate policy moment when it was kind of a high point for a certain approach to climate policy and for institutions helping bring forward a credible, legitimate, valid form of policy. So you might remember that the Supreme Court found carbon pricing to be constitutional as a way to reduce emissions. You might remember that lawmakers came together and made net zero not a nice to have, but law of the land by 2050. You might remember there was an election in which having a climate plan, sincere or not, was considered table stakes for being taken seriously. And even our friends in the oil patch that maybe Amy's going to remind us about came together in a little group called Pathways Alliance to try to convince everyone and to cosplay as climate policy concerned. They had a net zero plan and everything. You might remember part of that. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But in that moment, which might have been a high point or might have seemed a point of ascendance for climate policy, we had disinformation circulating in this conspiratorial adversarial mode. And a key moment was what I like to call the Great Canadian Climate Lockdown Conspiracy. And this was brought forward by an MP during the federal election as a piece of climate disinformation. It was brought forward through news channels, faux news channels on Facebook and in YouTube. Created a bit of a stir, was eventually taken down due to the ferment that resulted around that. But there's a few things that I kind of want to call back to this moment to think about. And Sonia, I know you've written on this a little bit as well. One is the fact that it was false, fabricated, completely misleading, and of course now we can see that nothing like that came to pass, seemed to have no consequences at all. There were no disincentives for this. The person that circulated this took it down for a minute when asked, but put it back up when the election was over. They won their seat. And I guess if there were any consequences, it would be for Aaron O'Toole, who's probably asked for it to be taken down, and then subsequently his party asked him to leave, perhaps in part for his position on climate. So that's a really important part of what we're going to talk about, the fact that there are clear incentives to produce mis- and disinformation in the current context to gain influence and impact, and no disincentives, very few guardrails, and almost no penalties for those that engage in this content. The second thing that's interesting is you might be thinking that, well, the fact that someone came forward with something so visibly false and had their followers kind of boost it for them, wouldn't they walk back from that? Wouldn't they be upset from that? Wouldn't the fact it didn't come true matter in some respect? And I would say this is not the case. And I think it's important to understand why it's not the case. These aren't really claims about the state of the world. These are elite cues for how to filter information and news you're going to encounter. They set an expectation, they set an anticipation, they create a sense of threat, and they teach you how to take that in a way that will align with your community, with your sense of identity, and if you're very political about it, the ways in which you're going to mobilize on behalf of your group. So I think this kind of content needs to be seen in this way as a kind of bid for sense-making to keep a group organized and mobilized, in this case, in an adversarial stance against climate policy. I think I'll close. I'm probably supposed to keep this very brief. Give a professor a microphone, and here we go. But if you're out there thinking that, well, I haven't heard of this lockdown, and we could raise our hands, and I know, Sonia, you would raise your hand because you know it well, but many of you wouldn't have heard of it before. But my guess is you have heard of 15-minute cities. Some of you will have heard of KICLI, which is a disinfluencer group targeting partners for climate projection programs all across municipalities. Some of you will be familiar with wind concerns or the idea of unwitting hosts coming forward in municipalities to block wind projects. And many of you, I hope, are familiar with the disinformation that circulates during wildfires around arson, around the idea that government is intentionally mismanaging these fires to create fears around climate policy, and creating adversarial moments with respect to legal orders that are intended to manage wildfires. These are all of a piece with this drift towards this more adversarial, manipulative, conspiratorial approach to climate policy, once official channels really did their job in bringing forward policy that was reducing emissions, that was gaining buy-in, and that was addressing the fact that most Canadians are deeply concerned about climate change and want governments and everyone else to act more quickly. So I would have more to say about that, as maybe we'll see in the discussions, but maybe I can just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Amy, Chris spoke about how these narratives persist despite a clear lack of disincentives. You've certainly found in your work pipeline conversations persist even after the economic case has collapsed. Maybe we'll turn to you next for your remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sonia, for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here today. My comments are really based on my research and thinking in the Canadian context. And so we know, of course, that climate disinformation has evolved from crude efforts, pardon the really bad pun there, to deny climate science, and to much more sophisticated and decentralized campaigns that are really about shaping public opinion and policymaking around climate and energy. So an example of this, something that caught my attention this summer, was a headline from the editorial board of the Globe and Mail, one of Canada's leading national newspapers, and it was that the small bore view of oil pipeline critics. And so in the editorial board's opinion piece, they were offering the newly elected Carney government some advice around oil pipelines. They said that, quote, every year that passes without another new oil pipeline, Canada will be failing to build meaningful buffers against US tariffs. So despite being incorrect and premised on some pretty fantastic assumptions, what's striking is this kind of messaging coming from a mainstream national newspaper, and this is very much part of a broader reemergence of pro-pipeline discourse. This isn't new for the Globe and Mail or its support of pipelines very openly in its public opinion and editorial positions, but the fossil fuel sector has long relied on very powerful narratives. Ethical oil, Sonia, you've written about being one of the most enduring. This idea that Canada is uniquely positioned to supply our oil to the world, when in reality our oil is among the most expensive, ecologically costly, carbon intensive to produce, and the cleanup, of course, is in the billions. But these are very similar efforts we see around things like carbon capture and storage, repeatedly overpromised and underdelivered, being touted at one time part of the pathways, commitments that this would be part of a net zero trajectory for the oil and gas sector. But this has really proven to be not viable commercially at scale, and has been massively subsidized by taxpayer dollars. But this is really a prominent feature as part of messaging to reassure Canadians that we can have oil and gas expansion and also climate action. We see a similar kind of repositioning of fossil gas in this context, being framed as a bridge fuel or a lower carbon alternative, when we know, in fact, that the life cycle emissions of LNG are as bad or worse than coal. But this narrative has been woven into provincial and federal energy policy and support for gas production, particularly the expansion of fossil gas in BC, to things like Enbridge's support for gas-powered heat pumps in Ontario. But we know that continued fossil gas expansion is fundamentally incompatible with a 1.5 or even a 2-degree world. We know, of course, that political leaders are very much amplifying these narratives. It's perhaps not surprising in places like Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, a former Conservative radio talk show host, who has repeatedly described the federal government and climate policy as an existential threat to Alberta, and used the tactic or threat of separatism to try to guarantee more pipelines. It's not how pipeline development works, but this is very rhetorically powerful. But this is not new. Smith's tactics are part of a much longer history. Starting in around 2014, the oil industry really amped up and changed its PR approach, blending professional campaigning with grassroots mobilization, and you see the emergence of groups like Action Canada that have really effectively responded to resistance to oil pipelines, for example. So this is part of what scholars call extractive populism, a potent mix of industry messaging, far-right activism, petro-masculinity, and regional alienation. And this has very much been fueling polarization and made conversations around energy transition essentially impossible to have in some places. We know that disinformation also thrives on selective truths, and for example, going back to some recent public opinion polling, you might be familiar with this number that up to 75% of Canadians want another new pipeline. At the same time, you have almost the same share of Canadians expressing concern, serious concern around climate, and wanting to see more climate action. But these things, in fact, are actually not incompatible. They really reflect how successfully elite narratives have framed fossil fuel expansion as being compatible with climate targets. The Trudeau government repeatedly said this, and even went so far when purchasing the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, which is now estimated to be at least $34 billion, taxpayers are on the hook for, that the profits from this pipeline would be used to fund Canada's energy transition, when the government knew very well that this project would not be making money, and in fact that they would very much be on the hook for the cost of this. So more recently, we've seen new myths around this idea of decarbonized oil coming from the new Carney government. This idea that Canada will be left behind if it doesn't build more fossil fuel infrastructure. But we know that the greatest threat to fossil fuel exports, being a major exporter, is declining demand. And so we know that global oil demand for oil is already shifting. The IEA's 2024 World Energy Report talks about the decline for oil coming sooner and faster than previously expected, largely due to the rise of EVs. And so Canada, being one of the highest cost and highest carbon producers, is especially vulnerable in this landscape. We also see a lot of disinformation around LNG in BC. Projects were sold to communities around promises of jobs and revenue and being compatible with climate targets, but we now know that the province is nowhere near meeting its carbon emissions reductions targets, and many LNG facilities have been exempt from things like industrial carbon pricing, and there's been extensive public subsidies to get these projects off the ground. So I'll just end here by saying, we know that the problem of disinformation is like the Greek mythology, the beast, the hydra, right? Multiple heads. When you cut off one head, two more spring up in its place. And so later today, and maybe in this panel, we'll get into how we approach this. Things like strengthening existing laws around the Competition Act for greenwashing, financial sector regulations to prevent misrepresentation in financial statements for the industry. Coming back around these questions of media, and call me old-fashioned, but also preventing our politicians from lying about the pace of which the challenge around the energy transition. So I'll stop it there for now. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amy. Michael, you've spent a number of years, dare I say a decade or decades, tracking some of these things through CAD. Walk us through some of the sort of main things you found in this space.
Great, and thanks. It's great to be here. I'm going to go over the basics of a regulatory framework that I think we can all move towards. I'm going to add a little bit more to some of the environment, especially at an eco-fiscal conference on the incentive structures, and then end with something hopeful on what I think are our directions forward. But I actually wanted to start with something that happened to me and my family last night that is sort of symptomatic of the whole issue. So I got a call at 7 p.m. last night from my wife, irate that our 13-year-old son, we have a 13-year-old son, which any parent in the room knows is a dangerous time to be a parent. The eye rolls. And so she called me, she said the smartphone that we had caved in to let him get in 7th grade, full disclosure, he had uninstalled the security software that we put on it and had installed Snapchat. So this was a grand violation, and we began a series of conversations with each other. And it sort of started with me saying, with her saying, well, we need to have some punishment. I said, well, we need to have some conversation with him. And then it went to, well, we need consequences. And I said, well, it's a journey. We need to be on the journey together. But he's broken our trust. And I said, and we need to rebuild trust together. And then she blurted out, God, I hate Mark Zuckerberg. To which, as the policy person on tech in the family, I was like, well, honey, this is a problem of Steve Jobs' creation, one, to create a complex system that changes every 6 months that we cannot keep track of, no matter how smart we are. And Snapchat is one of the few things Mark Zuckerberg has not yet bought up in our information universe. But it was symptomatic of everything that we're talking about, and it helps us sort of break out of the narrow silos, whether it's you're interested in climate issues or broader extremism issues, that the information environment and everything that has by design been created is a con, and it's a ruse to say that this is all of a sudden one family's responsibility, or it's your grandmother who can't figure out the difference between email and Facebook. All those things are actually by design. And the entire conversation of regulatory framework starts from this, oh my God, it's so complex. The internet is so many series of wires, I can't figure it out, right? Or it comes from the tech leaders who are like, this is too expensive, the people who are making untold amounts of profits. The people who say that they can colonize Mars somehow can't figure out the basics of regulation. So in this hopefully short portion, I'm just gonna go through the basics of the regulatory expectations, which are totally normal, to lay to the side this idea that we can't do this. So I start just thinking about three things: planes, pills, and pork. And you think of the way that we have regulated these different technologies that have different developments in society that have had similar characteristics. Planes was the advent of a new technology in the 1950s that needed to be commercialized. Pork, or say ground beef, a distributed system that had food safety issues that we figured out. And then pills, you know, the pharmaceutical industry, which has their famously long ads that we all love listening to. So if you look at the development of each one of these technologies, and planes are probably the best one because it was an onset of new technology that they asked people to get into a flying tube at 500 miles an hour, and nobody wanted to do it. And so the way they sold their industry of this new technology that promised to connect people across borders, in case that sounds familiar, is by having radical transparency. So the plane has an ill-named black box, which is nothing but. It is actually a flight recorder that the data in their very worst moment is shared not only with government regulators instantly, but the rest of the industry, so they can all improve their common safety practices. This was the only way that industry ever became commercial, is by having that level of transparency. And then, of course, they had the safety promise, they had the transparency, and when the plane goes down, you know the family's victims get paid out. This is the basics of what we expect out of every industry, and so you go on to thinking about pork in the industrial food economy. The same thing happened in the 80s and the 90s, developing HACCP systems that can go from feedlot to fork to say this is where the E. coli came from. And then, of course, you think of the FDA in the US and the very deep regulatory structure that Bobby Kennedy Jr. has not yet totally dismantled. He's working on it. But you think of something like Ozempic, very popular. If people were to find out that gave suicidal ideation, that would be off the market, we all think, probably in a week, right? So we have these different structures that exist. We know how to regulate new technology. We know how to regulate distributed technologies. But somehow, when it gets to tech, we have not passed in the United States any meaningful tech regulation in 20 years. Just none of it. Every single thing that comes up somehow is too complex for us to be figured out. So that's the first section, to just say there's such a long regulatory history that we can just put directly on top of this industry, as broad and as seemingly like water or utility as it can be, but every piece of it, we have a regulatory history to think it through. The two other things, just to add on to the great comments that the two, Amy and Chris, have had on the information environment. One thing I really want to just home in on is the monetization and the amplification that is always underneath the hood and is opaque in a way that, again, the airline industry only wishes that they could have ever been able to hide their crashes, let alone not be held to account. So you see the amplification in just something as simple as the takeover of X and the blue check system, how that was automatically manipulated to increase proactively the Nazi content on the platform. And that the people who are in our coalition who held a mirror up to that, got instantly sued not for the content, not for the actually whether or not it was true that the use of the N-word went up 500% in 5 days. No, it was just the act of actually monitoring it was what was being attacked in the lawsuits. So you have the vast increased opacity of what is happening under the hood. So we think we're having a normal conversation between two people, and there's really 500 people underneath the other person boosting that signal. And the other part is the monetization that I think we probably, as our coalition, only got into in the last probably 3 years to fully understand. So the digital online ecosystem is a $1 trillion business. And about 50 billion of that goes to fraud, according to the World Federation of Advertisers. Now that fraud is the second largest source of income for organized crime in the world, right after drugs. So that says something about why we are constantly having this system, and we think we are having one game, and there's another game going on, which is not just the amplification, but the monetization of it. So to Chris's points, like, we need to have design information systems that don't have us all thinking we're having one conversation while someone creates a much more powerful conversation underneath us. And then the last thing I'll just add on is to think about, what can we do? Is there any hope? Can these platforms actually regulate anything? Can we impose any regulations? And I will just point to the incredible amounts of change that did happen from 2020 to 2023, when we were in what we would call the halcyon days of regulation, of sort of thinking about regulating tech, where our coalition had multiple meetings with all the big tech companies, from Facebook to Twitter, TikTok, Google. And we got climate disinformation policies out of every one of them. They fell like dominoes. And they gave us policies on demonetization. Twitter even asked us to help them set up a Twitter space on climate, which we said, populate with IPCC scientists and leave out Michael Schellenberger. And they said, sure, we'll do that. And that's what that topic became. There was no question that you could do these things. You could do voluntary actions. And then you had the tidal wave of the last 18 months that have turned that back. But the last example I'll leave you with, and that's just to say, entirely possible, has been done already before. Let's not think that it can't. And the last example is really important, is that the January 6th committee in the States that was investigating how January 6th happened and the assault on the Capitol, they had a secondary report, which was left out of the final report, but is publicly available, on the role of social media companies in both contributing to it and or preventing it. And if there's anything that I would implore you to read as a follow-up, it's on Tech Policy Press, the write-up of the power that Facebook had to shut down the Stop the Steal campaign leading up to the November 4th election was considerable. And to see what they can do when they really want to do something was, they can do anything. I mean, these are supposedly the smartest people in the world. They know how to twiddle the knobs to stop really bad behavior, and they did. What they did between November 4th and January 6th was turn off every safety control and shut down all of their systems. And then that led to, obviously, the massive role that social media played in contributing to that disaster. So you can see we've done it before. You can see they've done it before. And to Sonia's point, you can now see a global movement everywhere from Japan to Canada to Australia, United Nations. All are passing or considering policies to say that this information environment is all of ours. It can't be stolen by people to put in some supposed black box that we will never get access to, not to understand, and not to influence. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you to all our panelists. I have many thoughts, but I know we started the panel a little late, so I will turn to the audience for any questions that are coming up. And I believe Kaylin has an extra microphone. There's a microphone right here on the side, or I think if you can project your voice, feel free. So I'll give a minute for any hands going up in the room. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Whatever is more comfortable. Oh, that's right. We need to keep our online audience in mind. So it's on this side of the room right here. If you make the turn.
Start asking. Okay, thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. My name is Lisa, and I've been working in the international policy and development and programming spaces for a long time. I've suddenly discovered nature, which is super exciting. It's been all around me all this time, and I never knew it was there. So that gets to, this is maybe a flipping sort of question or challenge. not to discredit the incredible work that you do, very valuable, and the work of climate activists around the world. We're focusing often on very high-level issues, and I think that we have to continue doing that. But having discovered nature recently and local economic development, there's so much we can do locally. And there's one statistic that, look it up just to make sure it's not misinformation. And that might take you down an interesting path. But I think we produce 800 million gallons of, use 800 million gallons of gas in local gas-powered tools that we use to mow our lawns, et cetera. That's more than automobiles burn. And that's just one example of how the climate issue is also a very local issue. A lot of our biodiversity is gone because we just plant 2 plants in our gardens, and we want our lawns to be super trim, and so we come and we have chemical sprays that kill everything on our lawns. So not to go into that too far, but just sometimes we're pointing at Mars when we can also point at Earth. And so I guess I'm flipping it and saying, to what degree is this focus on what industry and agriculture can do, et cetera, construction sector, all the sectors, what the macroeconomic issues are, to what degree does that create kind of a disinformation around what the individual can do? So I think we feel quite disempowered when we see fires and floods. Oh my gosh, we go into fear mode. We feel disempowered. And having worked recently in garden centers, if we can just give people, a variety of people, even in a commercial setting, one tiny example of something they might fall in love with and then be able to do on their own. This has incredible power. So I'm just sort of flipping it and saying, can we think about disinformation? Can we think about what we do in terms of a bigger disinformation scenario? Sorry to go on for so long. Thanks.
No, thank you so much. That's a very powerful question. I'll leave it as an open question to anyone on the panel. I will say that that is kind of precisely the aim of these very grand and overarching disinformation campaigns, is that they trickle down into making you disillusioned about the personal choices and about the effect that they might have. And so we're left with, well, I am powerless, and it's all it's too late, and it will cost too much, and we should just not do too much about it. But I know, Chris, you have specific local examples, but many of you obviously in your work, so I'll leave it open here.
I'll just start with you should talk to my son. I mean, this is the problem of things coming to the individual level, both the opportunity but the problem. And I think the way we generally look at it is it's unfair to come up with individual solutions to structural problems. And the example, my favorite example from Ontario in the 90s when I was working on waste management policy, was the creation of the Blue Box system, which was something created by Coke and Pepsi with the petchem industry to offshore their waste management costs onto taxpayers by creating a Blue Box system, where we had a refillable bottle system that had, a great economic benefits to it, great environmental benefits, obviously, and that was transferred into a single-use plastic system that then ended up with, and this is the catch, is everyone feeling like to do their part, they had to recycle their plastic bottles, when in truth, only 6% of recycled plastic gets used. That is the way that the industry explicitly tried to take a global problem and make it an individual's solution. And obviously that is something that you can't run uphill enough to compete.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I see there's a long list of questions there. There's a lot of great examples I could point to. There's organizations in this room that do a lot of what you're speaking about. And I think one of the things with I mentioned that hoax number before, I think that is evidence not of people having evaluated the climate science and decided it's not real, but of kind of rejecting a certain public narrative about climate and looking for something they can hold as an alternative. I think it is really important to understand where cynicism about local municipal government, around provincial government, around federal government comes from. I think the belief that there's a deep cynicism is widely held and is a real issue, but that it's over-amplified, so to speak. So when I speak with my students about this, when we do surveys around this, we find that Canadians radically overestimate the number of people that don't think government can get things done for them. It's a really interesting finding. Doesn't mean that that's not an important thing to think about, but I'm not sure the cynicism is as deeply entrenched as we might believe. Having said all that, this stuff we're talking about is in these local centers. Right? They're in the heat pump installers will give you stuff that's not true about why you need a gas backup for your hot water heater. You go to a local municipal meeting as they're discussing a wind energy or a battery siting. Show up to a discussion around evacuation orders that a BC wildfire is convening. These are deeply local issues, and I think it's really important that we pay attention to the information and the sense-making frameworks people have available to them, especially in moments of crisis when they're trying to figure out, just to get their bearings about the reality of the situation, when things feel certain, urgent, immediate, that something very important is on the line in their community, that their identity is threatened. So I think it's absolutely true that we have to focus on all the positive things that can be done, but this is definitely a local issue, even if the ways maybe we've described it have been a little more abstract in focusing on what I agree are fundamentally structural drivers of this.
Thank you. I think we can go to the next question. Go ahead.
I'm Bill Jeffrey with the Center for Health Science and Law. I'd just like to make the observation that a lot of lying is illegal. The Federal Competition Act, long before the recent amendments were made, prohibits misleading advertising with both a criminal and a civil standard. Parliament of Canada Act prohibits perjury. I don't know if it's ever been enforced, but up to 14 years imprisonment through the criminal code. Most provinces have consumer protection legislation. And interestingly, the Section 12 of the Parliament of Canada Act doesn't limit the lying to Parliament to people who are testifying. If you've ever testified before a parliamentary committee, it seems like the MPs that are sitting there do a lot of testifying themselves. And so I just invite you to consider why those laws are so rarely enforced and whether there are opportunities for civil society organizations to actually encourage people to make formal complaints, to put pressure on enforcement officials to take legal action or to do private prosecutions themselves.
Absolutely. Any feedback and comments?
I'll just say thanks. That's really excellent, right? A question of, why aren't we using the laws that we have available? I'll just speak briefly to the Competition Act and the recent changes, and that had a massive ripple effect through, the oil and gas industry, and you saw all of these websites being taken down, immediately around pledges and promises. And it's really yet to be seen, right, how this will actually be used in the long run. I think in the short run, we've actually had oil and gas companies walking back their climate commitments writ large. And so this is a particular opportunity to really have a more honest conversation. But there's a sort of a hangover of these narratives being taken up in political and policymaking circles. And so I think this is a really critical moment to be taking advantage of. But thanks for giving those other avenues as well.
Thank you. We'll go to the next
Hi, thanks.
question.
I really enjoyed the talks, so thanks for them. My name is Nick Rivers from the University of Ottawa, and I guess my question is about why the fossil sector seems to have such an overwhelming claim on our information ecosystem. They're, a small proportion of our economic output, and a tiny proportion of Canadian people work directly in the fossil fuel sector, and yet there seems to be this really kind of tidal wave of information coming from that sector. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about, is it tactical? Is it something that with the tactics, and why are they controlling our information space in a way that the clean energy sector, for example, which has a similar number of employees, isn't able to do?
That's a great question. Who wants to start us? off?
I think Amy should probably.
Yeah.
Sure,
Yeah.
I can start us off. Yeah, the short answer is incumbent power, right? These are very well entrenched companies. They are often quite unified in their lobbying associations. The green sector and renewable energy companies, right? It's much more fragmented, much more nascent, and we've seen as attacks on the renewable sector, moratoria on renewable energy in Alberta, right, for the threat, the perceived threat that it posed to the gas industry. So, I think you're absolutely right. The oil and gas sector is shedding employment, right, threats of automation, things like that. But that doesn't prevent this really doubling down on the PR machine. Really, the change started in 2014 when the industry was really taken on its back foot with some really powerful campaigns against oil, campaigns against dirty oil, and this narrative really caught the industry on their back foot. And it really had a cascade effect in terms of really investing in a new way in the PR of it. But it's really mixed, right, with this sort of grassroots activism and has made it very powerful and much more decentralized. And so I think those are the narratives that are often picked up in media by politicians and amplify the effect of the industry beyond what they do with their advertising, which if you walk around Ottawa, the Pathways Alliance always usually has some kind of advertising campaign on the go. So I think those are really some of the key drivers that are amplifying their impact.
Yeah, I mean, to say that in a much worse way, concentrations of wealth and power are profound. That development of Pathways Alliance in 2021, the precursor to what became Pathways Alliance in 2022, where 95% of the oil producers came together in a single organization. It was for the purposes of a climate plan, so a sustainability idea. You can act in an anti-competitive way in some cases if you're advancing sustainability goals. It's very interesting that they have walked back completely from that as a result of the Competition Act, as Amy has noted, but not disbanded and simply pivoted to energy security, supporting CFL teams, supporting education, all kinds of things. So I think there's something really important there just in the kind of concentration of wealth and power, attempting to bend the regulatory and financing frameworks of government around their interest and perspectives, which I guess is what we would call incumbent power. The other piece I find compelling around this is some of Jessica Green's work. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, Nick, but the idea that the industry's not going to sit around and watch their assets degrade in value and their investments degrade in value as the energy transition takes place, which will happen absent them doing a lot of things. And I think that's what we're seeing now in terms of like the advertising, the public relations blitz, all kinds of efforts to retain social license. We saw it when the Ukraine war initially started. We're kind of seeing something similar inside Canada's domestic space with pipelines. So I think recognizing that we're not going to just simply regulate them out of existence with kind of economically optimal policies, that it's going to be much more of a political struggle to deal with the concentration of wealth and power that sits in that industry.
And I'd just add three numbers to this. So 600 million, 50, and 2014 to key off what Amy was mentioning. So 600 million is how much the industry spends on disinformation every year. So that's a lot for people who don't have $600 million among us. And that has been done for 50 years. And so if you look into the history that DISMOG, I see Jeff here, they've done a lot of exposés of just how long that disinformation campaign has been going on from the 50s onward. And spending at those incredible numbers. And then the other real key is 2014, this transition period for the internet. If you look at the period of our information environment from 1994, when we all first got email, to 2004, those were the figuring it out days. And then the next decade, where actually you saw some very good positive social change movements. What happened from 2014 is the birth of the online advertising industry and the shutdown of the opacity of what was happening online. And it is within that monetized and shrouded environment that, what a surprise, climate denial, which was on the wane, it was going down, that's when it had its great rebirth. So why did that happen? Because people were able to do what they couldn't do in the light of day and to do it at scale, which is where we end up where we are at now in 2024.
Thank you. I think we're okay for time for just the remaining 2 questions. Perfect.
Hi, I'm Natalie Brender. I'm Director of Policy at the Canadian Public Health Association. As you all know, there are structurally identical conversations taking place about these issues of systemic mis and disinformation in the public health sphere with health disinformation, also in the area of online toxic masculinity and ideals and discourses about gender that are being so harmful. My question to all of you is, to what extent do you see value in addressing the issue of climate disinformation and what to do about it, separate from those other areas? Clearly, there's a different kind of industry involved, but there are industry incentives in those areas too. What is the distinctive value of addressing climate separately from those conversations or jointly with them?
Great question.
I mean, I would say they are the exact same conversation. The fight for the rights of trans youth is the fight for against climate disinformation. And in fact, those 2 issues in particular, we helped support Drilled do this recent series, Drilled podcast. Amy Westervelt's an incredible journalist. You should listen to her series. She did one on how oil and gas money is actually funding the radical anti-trans movement. And you're like, why and how does that happen? But it is one of the great things about this unifying technology is that it's a unified enemy that is attacking everyone at the same time. So we built our first network map back in 2020 of climate deniers. We used Desmog's database of people with paid ties to the industry and said, map these people, how are they gonna act month to month? We get to watch them as a network tool across Twitter at the time. And we saw how they roved from being 1 month climate deniers till at the onset of the pandemic, which really blew up our map. But we saw how they became anti-maskers the next month. They became anti-BLM conspiracists the following month. And then they became misogynists against Kamala Harris when she got appointed. So you see that fight is actually the same fight for everyone. And again, back to, it sounds boring, but transparency would change a lot of this if you saw who was pulling which strings at which time.
Anything to add? Chris?
Yeah, just quickly, I agree with that, and I think there's also a specificity sometimes to this. And I'll add one historical and then just a brief comment. So Naomi Oreskes, who some of you will be familiar with, wrote a book called Merchants of Doubt, trying to figure out what was going on in her life when all kinds of stuff was entering her email box and then other avenues as she was writing on climate change and the ways in which the skepticism and attempts to undermine it were not legitimate and were not in line with science. And she was trying to figure out why that was the case. And what she realized that even though the skirmish was taking place on the battleground of science, it was actually an argument about regulation and philosophies of government. And it was about the concern that climate change would require an expansion and concerted and durable effort to use the regulatory and redistributive functions of the state for this to be able to happen. The same thing that's true of the energy transition, by the way. And so what this was a long-form argument and battle going back to the 80s, and some people would go back to the 50s, and Jeff, I don't know how far back you take it, but that this is what this was about. It was very much about a theory and understanding of government with vis-a-vis corporate power, particularly when corporate power is developing products that impose harms and dangers on people. So I think that's like a long arcing conversation that the climate piece kind of has good visibility into and kind of helps us see the unfolding of a longer trajectory. I think the public health climate intersections are really important in that post-pandemic moment because you see, to kind of Michael's point, the anti-public health influencers and the anti-government influencers as the pandemic is waning because it turns out vaccines work. And it turns out public health officials and policies are coming down. You see those people bridging into the climate space at the moment when climate denial has been pushed out of official channels and serious political conversations. So I think that intersection in particular is especially important to the way this manifests in Canadian policy.
Thank you. And I think one final question.
Thank you for taking my question. Hey, my name is Alex Cole-Fergus. I work for Climate Action Network Canada. And I think about these questions all the time, so I really appreciate all the information that I'm getting. This is super helpful. I think one quick question for me is just like, is it worth using these massive tools that are never going to make profit off of really good information or really sharp debate and actual facts. Obviously it makes a lot more sense for them to rage farm and to generate a whole bunch of like hate and like disinformation. And so is it worth trying to invest time in those spaces? And I'm thinking especially social media, but not only. It could also include advertising. So that's my question.
We talked about this a lot 2 weeks ago in Ottawa at the other summit, so I suspect you have some thoughts.
I have a ton of thought, but you're not going to speak. You know so much in all this.
I am amplifying the voices of, so I'm referring to another summit on climate disinformation that was held by the University of Ottawa, and we talked about this a lot with the ECCC as well, who is doing some thinking around what does, an integration of climate disinformation look like into a communications strategy in this country. And I would say that historically, the right has always understood the value of amplifying kind of strategic tactics and communication efforts, while the left has historically thought, truth is self-evident. And climate is a really great test case that we've seen has not moved the needle despite the truth that we've all known. And so I think there's tremendous value in amplifying, pro-climate messaging. Jeff is going to get into this a little later in the day in the third panel, but I would say there's tremendous value, and one really valuable way to do that is to advocate for better tech policy. And I think if we do have that, and if information ecosystems do become better spaces for those kinds of conversations, more of us will sort of see that inherent value. But if anyone else has anything to add.
Yeah, I would say definitely yes.
Yeah.
Like, go compete in these spaces. I would say don't overly pathologize what's happening in there, but look at through the lens of conspiracy, look through the lens of influencers, which are not all bad or conspiracy pilled, to understand how information becomes impactful and influential and moves. And these are just really important spaces to compete, to provide information and sense-making frameworks that will allow people to see why the things they're concerned about, other people are also concerned about these things, whether it's climate, whether it's public health, whether it's just a safe space in which to have conversations with your 13-year-old child, perhaps. So I think I have more to say on this. I know Alex maybe will talk about it at some point, but I would say definitely yes. I think institutions need to adapt to the information environment we're in and learn to do engagement differently if they ever hope to cite a wind project, if they ever hope to stand up for bike lanes, if they ever hope to have any of the stuff we already have persist through a pretty difficult moment.
Yeah, just +1 to thinking about the local action. And we work with a group called Green Light America, who's doing these local site fights, and they've been incredibly successful on the local organizing side. I think your broader question of like, do I stay on X or not, which every nonprofit has asked itself monthly, there's no easy answer to that. Like, you can make an argument either which way. Now we've turned into a cesspool. Was that going to happen anyway? If you're a woman online, is it just too dangerous to be on there for you personally? Those are all important things. But I think the big picture capitalist trends that you see over the last 5 years that have happened, like we're at the bottom right now and maybe going further down, but there were times when Threads, when it came out, marketed itself as, quote, a less insane alternative to Twitter. So what was that? That's telegraphing the values that we're all talking about. And I'll give you one other example, which is Bumble. Right? Like an online dating app designed for women to have a safe space where the first interaction has to be from the woman to the man, to the other partner. And so that is to say we can design any space that is incredibly profitable and gets people to have the communities they want. We're at a particularly dark time where everyone says anarchy has to be our future. And that's obviously, nobody believes that, and that is the narrative we're fighting. Are we just wandering into anarchy controlled by billionaires, or does everybody actually want online safe spaces? And back to my argument with my wife last night, everybody wants this. Every parent wants it. Every Uber driver you talk to wants it. There's a great future for it, and it's going to be a lot of irritating things for nonprofits to say, where do I put my time?
Amy, any final thoughts to add?
Yeah, I think the climate movement has a great history of building coalitions and sometimes unexpected allies, and with health advocacy and learning from the kind of tobacco playbook. Like, there's lots of a rich history of movements learning from each other and strengthening. And I think this is the moment, I think, for the climate movement to embrace this as one key area that really needs more attention and coalition work around. So yes from me as well. Thanks for the question.
So thanks everyone for your questions. Thank you to our panel. And I'm so encouraged by the number of interdisciplinarity and the different perspectives that have already come up, both in the questions and in our perspectives, especially in terms of pulling different levers towards hopefully the same aim here. So, for us, the beat I keep drumming in my own work is that tech policy is climate policy. Public health policy is climate policy. We'll hear later momentarily, economic policy is good climate policy. So thank you to everyone. Join me in a round of applause.
What a great panel. Thank you again to Amy Janzwood, Michael Khoo, Chris Russell, and Sonia Solomon. So before the Walrus, I worked at Twitter Canada as head of news and government partnerships. So I appreciated the nuance of that conversation and how quickly the landscape shifts. Two things to add, and I've been just fiercely taking notes, to the point on everyone wanting a better internet and stronger social media. If anyone hasn't heard the term, look up Inshitification by Cory Doctorow, Canadian, because it really captures what has happened to so many of the apps and social spaces. And often when I say the word, people say, sorry, shitification is the word, because it captures what we're talking about there. And I will also say, extending that tech theme, I have 3 emojis as a response to the conversation. A lot of thinking emojis. I think a lot of us were that thinking emoji during the conversation. Definitely moments for the double exclamation mark emoji. And then I had a few mind-blown emojis too, just some of those insights and examples. And I think it definitely is the intersection of this work, which is a big point of us being here today together. For those of you in the room, we will be taking a 20-minute break now before we get into the next discussion. So please step out. I see some people have already run for the coffee. Help yourself to refreshments. And then we'll be back here at 11:05 to explore markets under pressure, eco-fiscal tools, and climate disinformation. And if you're online, head into the kitchen, whether you're at work or home, take a break, and we'll see you all in 20 minutes or so. Thank you.